Hello YouTube and welcome to another video. In this video I'll be giving you a tier list of all the civilizations. Before I start, I'd like to mention that this tier list is based on my own opinion and some of you may disagree with the rankings. Before I start, I'd also like to say that each civilization is given 3 buffs and each of these buffs determine how good they are. So let's start with the Romans. Now the Romans have the following buffs. They have a plus 5% pikeman defense, they have a plus 5% healing speed, and they have a plus 30 boost to building production. Now I'm going to start by rating the Romans a B, and B is around average. I'll start with the pikeman defense. Now you'll notice for all the civilizations, the first buff is always an increase in 5% to one of the troop types' defense. So your choice of which civilization depends on what troop type you're going to main. So for example, if you main pikemen, Rome should be something that you're considering since they give pikemen defense. Now I'll move on to the other 2 buffs that Romans give. They give a 5% healing speed. Now this 5% healing speed is pretty good. Healing speed is always useful, since it often takes days to heal and it can reduce the amount of healing speed ups you need to use, so it's not bad at all. And then we have the plus 30 boost to building production. Now this is quite innocuous, but based on my experience, I can say that this plus 30 is quite minor. It might make a large difference at the start, but ultimately it's a small difference, and so it's not really noteworthy. And now we'll move on to the Egyptians. Now the Egyptians, just like the Romans, give a plus 5% pikeman defense. They also give a plus 5% troop resource load. Finally, they give a plus 5% gathering troop unit loss prevention. Now let me explain. The pikeman defense is intuitive, it's obviously just like the Romans' first buff. But then what about the troop load? If you've played other games like this, you'll know that troop load indicates how much resource you're able to accumulate away from your city, and it determines how many resources you can gather. This is extremely useful to have, especially for free to play. Then there's also the plus 5% gathering troop loss prevention, which means that when you are attacked when you're gathering something, and all your troops die and return to the city, 5% less of those troops will end up dead, i.e. they're not able to be healed. This is a very good choice for free to play, giving the Egyptians a B. They're very useful to use as free to play, but if you're a high spender, it's better to choose another civilization. Let's now move on to the French civilization. Now, unlike the previous 2 civilizations, the French civilization gives a plus 5% cavalry defense. Now it also gives a plus 5% resources exchange rate. And finally it gives a plus 10% gathering troops defense. Now the first buff is intuitive, but I'd just like to mention that cavalry have less defense than pikemen, so the buff for pikemen is actually a bit more useful than the buff for cavalry. Then let's move on to the second buff, which is the plus 5% resources exchange rate. This means that you'll be able to better exchange your resources from different types, so from wood to stone, for example. However, the exchange is quite poor anyways, so it's better that you don't do this at all. And then there's a plus 10% gathering troops defense. This is actually a really good buff, and the reason is that if you're fighting someone in the open field and there's a resource node nearby, you can actually move to the resource node and bait them to attack you, and then you'll be fighting each other, but you'll have a plus 10% defense. However, this strategy is less likely to work against more experienced players, but it can be used as a deterrent to prevent your enemies from attacking you. I'm giving this civilization a B. It's pretty solid and it can be useful. Next, we'll move on to the Byzantine civilization. Now this civilization's first buff is a plus 5% swordsman defense. The second buff is a plus 5% to all unit types siege damage. And its third buff is a plus 5% stone gathering speed. Now the first buff is pretty solid, especially since swordsmen have a high defense. The second buff, however, is quite underwhelming. Siege damage is pretty bad. It can only be used against imperial cities, which aren't player cities, and all it does is increase your damage to the walls. And the stone gathering bonus, it's not bad, but compared to the other civilizations, it's just not as good. So overall, I'm giving the Byzantines a C. Next, let's move on to the British. Now the first buff is a plus 5% archer's defense. The second buff is a plus 10% player citadel's defense bonus. The third buff is a plus 5% production of mills. Now the archer defense is not bad, but archers do have a lower defense than say swordsmen and pikemen, so it's not as good. The plus 10% citadel defense bonus, however, is better. It can be used to help prevent your city from being destroyed, and it can actually help that altogether. It can in fact save your city at one point, so it's not bad at all to have as backup. The third buff, it's not that good really. It's a 5% production of mills, but then again, you get more resources from gathering than from your mills. Overall, I'm going to give the British a C. It's not bad, it's just not as good as the B-tier civilizations. Next, let's move on to the Chinese civilization. The first buff is a plus 5% archer's defense. The second buff is a plus 8 villager capacity. The third buff is a plus 10% walls durability. Now, the first buff is just like the British buff. It's archers, it's good if you main archers, but otherwise it's not as good as swordsmen or pikemen. The villager capacity is really good in the first few days of the game, but afterwards it's not as good at all. The final buff is kind of useless. Plus 10% wall durability might sound good, but then if you're at the point where you're at less than 10% of your wall durability, it's probably going to break anyways. Overall, I'm going to give the Chinese a D. Their villager capacity can really come in handy in the first few days of the server, but otherwise it's just not a good civilization. Next, let's move on to the Japanese civilization. The first buff is a plus 5% to swordsman's defense. The second buff is a plus 5% attack bonus against player citadels. The third buff is a plus 10% attack against tribes. Now the first buff is again pretty good, especially if you main swordsman. The second buff is alright. It's not amazing because attacking citadels is usually never worth it anyways, but it's okay if you're working together to zero a city. The third buff is really good, and maybe the best buff offered by any civilization. 10% attack against tribes means that you'll be able to attack tribes one level higher than you otherwise would be able to without this buff, and this means more rewards, more loot. Overall, I'm giving the Japanese civilization an A. It's, in my opinion, the best civilization. Now, let's move on to the 8th and final civilization, the Koreans. The first buff is a plus 5% cavalry defense. The second buff is a plus 500,000 looting limit. And the third buff is a plus 10% resource storage protection rate. The first buff is alright, it's pretty good if you main cavalry, although cavalry have a less normal defense. The second buff is not bad, especially if you have a farm account, because you'll be able to farm more resources from them, since there's no resource trading in the game. You have to actually take it from them. And the third buff is alright. It's not that useful, because if your city's attacked, you'd be more concerned about losing troops than losing a bit more resources. Overall, I'm giving the civilization a D. It's not that good. Anyways, that concludes this video. I hope you found it useful.